Hello. Good morning or afternoon. It is such a beautiful day that we are reading outside today until these wasps that are flying around attack us. But anyway, so we have one vocab word for Shakespeare Stealer, chapter 16 today. And the word is scrying glass. Is a ball or mirror used for divination or fortune telling.
Maybe you should recap what whis and stuff means.
I haven't figured out what whis means. Whis means think? Mm-hmm. Okay. Whis means think. What was happening when we left off?
He just failed to steal the book.
He just failed to steal the book, and Julian had saved him from the bad neighborhood where his ears were about to be cut off, and they are doing school, and that's pretty much it, right? All right, here's a note about the next chapter. In chapter 16, the author mentions that when Dr. Lopez, a Jew, attempts to poison Queen Elizabeth, all Jews are expelled from England. However, according to our research, we find that Jews were expelled from England long before Queen Elizabeth's reign. It is true that Queen Elizabeth did employ a physician named Dr. Lopez of Jewish descent, who, allegedly in league with the King of Spain, was tried and executed for a plot in which he was suspected of attempting to poison the Queen. It seems as though the Queen herself was not all convinced of his guilt, as she delayed his execution for a time. We also know that even though Jews were formally expelled from England approximately 300 years prior to this incident, small groups of Jews sought refuge in England during the Spanish Inquisition and became known as Marranos or Conversos, Jews that had converted to Christianity. Though outwardly appearing Christian, many of these Jews maintained their Jewish heritage, even if they did not actively practice the tradition of their religion. As Dr. Lopez was known as a Marrano, his trial and execution sparked a renewal in anti-Semitic as well as anti-Spanish sentiment among the English people. Regardless, the incident would not have gone unnoticed in Shakespeare's lifetime, and experts suspect that his character Shylock in the play The Merchant of Venice may have been inspired by these events. All right, on to chapter 16. Don't let that fly away. In the tiring room, Mr. Hemmings was putting more white in his beard for his part as Polonius, and Mr. Shakespeare, dressed all in armor, was touching up his ghostly white makeup. Mr. Hemmings gave me a startled look. Where is the book? Jack insisted on taking it over, Sander answered for me. Lord, help us. Still, said Mr. Shakespeare, it's better than I feared. In view of his habit of dropping things, I expected that Widge had let it fall into hell. Hell? I echoed. Our word for the cellar beneath the stage. Sander leaned close to me. Don't listen to him. He's just heckling you. I ken that. Mr. Hemmings sighed. I'm due on stage. We'll settle this later. He dusted the excess powder from his beard and started for the door, pausing long enough to say to Mr. Shakespeare, You wouldn't care to trade duties for a time, would you, Will? I'll write the plays and you run the company? Mr. Shakespeare considered a moment. I suppose that's no more absurd than letting Jack hold the book. He turned his gaze back to the looking-glass. The man who played Laertes came into the room and struck up a conversation with Sander. I let my thoughts wander and my eyes with them. Because of his helmet, I could not see Mr. Shakespeare's face directly, only his reflection in the glass. He had finished repairing his ghostly pallor, and now sat staring at his reflection, not as if assessing his appearance, but as though the looking-glass were a scrying glass, and, like the gypsies he resembled, he was seeing into another time or place. And perhaps he was. Perhaps he was preparing his next play in his mind, even as he prepared himself physically for this one. Before I could look away, his gaze caught mine in the glass. He frowned. Do you have nothing better to do than lounge about in the tiring room? Well, I was to hold the book, sir. Then you should have held it more firmly. He rose and stood from the room, his armor clanking. What was that about? Said Sander. I hardly can. Was a truly cross with me, do you whiz? I can't tell sometimes with him." "That's so," said the man who plays Laertes. "He's a hard one to know. They say that in his younger days he was a good companion, and he still can be on occasion, but much of the time he's withdrawn and pensive. If having a touch of genius also means having so strong a dose of melancholy, I'll settle for merely being extremely talented." "And extremely conceited," Sanders said. "By the by, you two haven't met yet, have you? Widge, this is Chris Beeston. Not so long ago he was a lowly prentice like us." Beeston held out a hand, which I took hesitantly. "Widge, eh? You're the one who made me do a little jig to cover for Henry when he dropped his lines. How is it you're not out there now, holding the book?" "It's not me fault," I said. "Why does everyone fret so about the book?" "Because," Beeston said, "they have a way of ending up in the wrong hands if we're not careful." "What do you mean?" I said, though I knew well enough. "He means sometimes they get stolen," Sanders said. "Oh." I did not care for the direction this conversation was taking. Who would want to steal a play? "Other theater companies." Beeston leaned forward and lowered his voice. "I've heard it said that's why Will Kemp left the company. They said he made off with the book of As You Like It and sold it to a touring company in Leicester." "Leicester?" I said, my voice sounding strained. Beeston nodded. "The man who runs the Leicester company was with the Chamberlain's men for a time, back when I was still doing girls' parts. A fellow named Simon Bass." I feared this was coming, and my face was already so that it did not betray me, or so I hoped. "He gave me my first fencing lessons." Beeston held out his right hand. "I've still got the scar there, where he struck me. I never knew him well, but there was always something about him that didn't go down right. I never quite trusted him. One thing I will admit, he knew more about makeup than anyone else in the company. His Shylock in Merchant of Venice is one of the most astounding transformations I've ever seen. But then, perhaps it wasn't all acting." His voice became even softer. "They say his name is really Simon Bashevi, and he's a Jew himself." "A Jewel?" I echoed. The others burst out laughing. "What?" "A Jew," Beeston said. "Don't you know what a Jew is?" "Of course, I heard you wrong, that's all." In truth, the concept was hazy in my mind. I knew that Falconer had killed a man for calling him one. To mask my ignorance, I repeated what Falconer had said. "There are no Jews in England, only former Jews." "Well, that's so," Beeston said, "after what Lopez did." Though I had no notion who Lopez was, I nodded knowingly. It was not until a month or two later that I learned how Dr. Lopez had tried to poison the Queen and been executed, and how all other Jews had been forced to renounce their religion or be banished. Sander jumped up from the bench then, as suddenly as if struck by one of his dress pins. "The cock crow!" "The what?" "The cock crow! Come!" I followed him from the tiring room. "I missed the first one while I was dressing, and Jack is sure to forget this one." Jack stood by the stage entrance, peering at the book as though he'd lost his place long ago. He gave us a sullen glance. "I don't need no help." "I wasn't offering any," Sander told him. "I've come to do the cock crow." "I can do it well enough," Jack said. "Where is it?" He ran a finger down the page. "Cock crows. There. Off with you now." "I've practiced it," Sander insisted. "I'll do it." "I know how to crow," Jack said. On the stage, Mr. Shakespeare gave the cue in his hollow ghost's voice. "Adieu, adieu, adieu. Remember me." Both Jack and Sander opened their mouths. One let out a sound reminiscent of a squalling baby. The other sounded uncannily like a stuck pig. Either by itself or would have been startling. Together, they were positively unnerving. I shook a finger in the ear that had borne the brunt of the noise. "Do you truly wish that's how a cock sounds?" "I suppose you can do it better?" Sanders said. "I'm a country white, remember? I ken what a cock sounds like, and that's not it." Jack scowled at me. "As it so happens," he said, "this was a Danish cock." Sander and I looked at one another, then broke into fits of laughter. We had to stagger back to the tiring room, holding our hands over our mouths, and close the door, lest we infect the audience. It had been a long while since I'd laughed so freely, if indeed I ever had. By all accounts, Jack did not furnish a single word to assist the poor players, who were forced to invent or to omit whole passages. He was not permitted to hold the book again. Neither, unfortunately, was I, not because I was not trusted, but because our bookkeeper recovered and resumed his duties. So I had no further chance to carry off the script. I could not honestly say that I regretted it. The longer I stayed with the company and the longer I was away from Falconer, the less incentive I felt to complete my mission. I had not forgotten the reward promised me, but that, too, prompted me less and less. All I had was Bass's word in the matter, and judging from what Chris Beeston had said, his word was not worth much. One thing I did know from hard experience: a master's promise to apprentice is likely to be redeemed only at the last lamas, as they say, which was to say, never. When a week went by and Falconer had made no attempt to contact me, I convinced myself that he had lost patience and returned to Leicester to report to Simon Bass. Still, I stuck close to the theater and in my free hours to Mr. Pope's. Though Falconer was impatient, I had the feeling he was used to getting what he wanted, one way or another. I applied myself to my daily tasks and lessons at the theater, and to my surprise began to actually enjoy them. Dr. Bright had trained me as a man might train a dumb beast, through repetition, reinforced by beatings. Here, the method was different. We were given credit for some intelligence. We were expected to learn each technique quickly and to practice what we had learned on our own until it became second nature. At the end of the week, I was, to my astonishment, given a small part to play, that of the messenger in the Spanish tragedy. I have a letter to your lordship, I was to say, and from Pellegrino, that's imprisoned, and then, I, my good lord. That was the extent of my role. I swear by St. Pintle that I practiced those lines 1,000 times at the very least. I believe I may have repeated them in my sleep. Sander bore with me the infinite variations I employed in saying my lines, and my inability to say the name Pedringano properly, until he could bear it no longer. One morning, as I stood before the looking-glass in our room, saying, Perigando, Predingango, Pedigringo, he reached the limits of his tolerance. Widge, for all the loves on earth, what will you do when they give you an entire speech? I stared at him in dismay. Oh, Gis, do you think they will? Sander began to laugh. What did you just say? I said, will they give me a whole speech? No, you didn't. You said, do you think they will? Not do you wish, but do you think? He slapped me on the back, and for a change I did not flinch. My boy, I believe you're turning into a Londoner.
I told you it was thing.
Good job. Gog's bread, I muttered, not knowing whether to be pleased or alarmed. I hope not. The play was to be put before an audience on Wednesday. Tuesday night I scarcely slept. Toward daybreak, as I sat up reading in the half-light one of the ballad sheets on the walls, Sander woke me and peered drowsily at me. What are you doing? Fretting, mostly. He clucked his tongue. It's only 3 lines, Widge. All the more cause to fret, and I say them wrong, I'll have no chance to redeem myself. Sander sighed. Do you want me to play the lines for you? You've a part of your own. I can play more than one. It's done all the time. Nay, I am not one to quit. I'll do it, somehow. He yawned and lay back down. After a moment I said, It gets easier, doesn't it, playing a part? Sander did not reply. He had fallen asleep. Eventually I succumbed to sleep myself and woke with the sun on my face. I shook my head to dispel the dream that had filled it. In the dream I made my maiden entrance upon the stage, and the audience at once broke into gales of applause and laughter. Pleased at having created such a sensation without opening my mouth, I smiled and bowed deeply, to discover that I stood before them in puris naturalibus, that is to say, naked as a worm.
I guessed it.
Oh, Sander, what a dream, I said. But Sander was not in bed, nor in the room. Then it came to me that if the sun was up, I should be too, long since. I scrambled into my clothing and hurried downstairs. Goodwife Willingson was feeding the smaller children. Good morning, Widge, the boys chorused. I gulped a bowl of porridge, burning my mouth in my haste, and excused myself. God bye, Widge, the boys called after me. I paused long enough to wave to them. Their enthusiasm made me smile as I closed the door and set out for the theater. 100 yards or so from the house, I became aware of another set of footprints behind me, even swifter than my brisk pace. Some fellow player was late for morning rehearsal, I guessed. As I turned to see, a hand seized the neck of my tunic. I was dragged into the side road, hoisted like a sack of grain over a low hedge, and flung on my back in the grass. Uh-oh. Seems as though Falconer may have caught up with him. We're only scheduled for 16. Do you want to read 17 too?
Yeah.
Okie dokie. Alright, I don't have the sheet for that. Alright, that's it for right now. We'll be back in a bit to continue.